Hi everyone. Something has happened that hasn't been seen on the world political stage for over 2 decades. For the first time since the early 2000s, Putin has spoken to the United States in the language of an ultimatum, leaving no room for ambiguous interpretations. The formulations were extremely direct, the tone cold, and the signal was heard not only in Washington, but also in all key capitals of the world. Ukraine, in this statement, turned out to be not the cause, but the trigger. Let's immediately outline what we will analyze today and why it is important to watch it to the end. We will reconstruct the chain of events that led to this moment. We will analyze what the ultimatum consists of and why the U.S. reaction was noticeably more restrained than many expected. And most importantly, we will answer the question of what this means for the conflict in the near future, and why the situation is fundamentally different from anything that has happened before. Let's start with the background. Fact 1. In recent years, the rhetoric between Moscow and Washington has become increasingly harsh. But one unspoken tradition has remained. Even in the most tense moments, the parties left room for maneuver, for diplomatic formulas, for behind-the-scenes agreements. The statements were sharp, but careful. Why is this important? This model made it possible to keep the conflict within manageable limits. Everyone understood the red lines, even if they publicly denied their existence. It was a game with rules, albeit a cynical one. What does this change? The ultimatum destroys this model. It does not imply bargaining, it demands an answer. And this is what came as a shock to many observers. Fact 2. The reason for the harsh statement was a combination of actions by the United States and its allies in the Ukrainian direction. It is not about one decision, but about a whole series of steps. Expanding military assistance, discussing new formats of presence, and increasingly frank statements about a long-term strategy. Why is this important? In Moscow, this was perceived as an attempt to fix a new status quo without taking into account Russian interests, not as a temporary measure, but as a strategic course. What does this change? When one side feels that it is being systematically ignored, sooner or later it moves from signals to direct demands. And this moment, it seems, has come. Now the ultimatum itself. Fact 3. In his speech, Putin clearly outlines several conditions, the fulfillment of which is considered mandatory for de-escalation. The formulations were devoid of the usual diplomatic courtesy. It was not a call for dialogue, but a statement of opposition. Why is this important? Russia has not used this style in relations with the United States since the early 2000s, when a new system of global security was just being formed after the Cold War. Then Moscow was still looking for its place. Now it is defining it. What does this change? Responsibility for further developments is publicly shifted to Washington. This is a strong psychological move, because now any development of the situation will be viewed through the prism of this ultimatum. The U.S. reaction was revealing. Fact 4. Instead of the usual series of harsh statements and immediate threats, there was a pause. The comments were cautious, with an emphasis on the need for consultation and assessment of what was said. Why is this important? A pause in politics is always a sign of a difficult choice. When the answer is obvious, it is given immediately. Here, there was no obviousness. What does this change? This suggests that the ultimatum touched a sensitive point, perhaps not in form, but in content. The Ukrainian factor deserves special attention. Fact 5. Kyiv finds itself in an ambiguous position in this situation. On the one hand, it is a key element of the conflict. On the other hand, real decisions are not made in Kyiv, and the ultimatum was addressed specifically to the United States, not to Ukraine. Why is this important? This is a direct indication of who Moscow considers to be the real opponent. Ukraine in this logic is a field, not a player. What does this change? This is an unpleasant signal for the Ukrainian leadership. Its subjectivity in negotiations is once again being questioned. Now let's move up a level. The culminating meaning of this ultimatum lies not in specific points, but in the very fact of its appearance. Russia declares that it is ready to live in a new reality and demands that this reality be taken into account. Emotionally, this looks like a return to the tough policies of the early century, but with one important difference. Then Russia was only gaining strength in warning. Now she is demonstrating readiness for the consequences. In the coming week, we will see either an attempt to reformat the dialogue or a further increase in tension. There is practically no middle ground. The ultimatum is a point after which it is extremely difficult to back down without losing face. And this is where the most subtle and dangerous part of the whole story begins. Because an ultimatum is not just words, it is always a test of the strength of the entire system of international relations. It is important to understand why such a form was chosen now and what lies behind the externally emotional presentation, which many rush to call a flash or an explosion. Fact next. In recent months, contacts between the military and diplomatic channels of Russia and the United States have narrowed significantly. Formally, they remained, but in essence they were reduced to an exchange of positions without real convergence. Each side believed that the other was bluffing and would eventually back down. Why is this important? When faith in compromise disappears, the value of a strong signal increases. An ultimatum in such a situation is an attempt to shake up the partner and force him to reconsider his calculations. What does this change? The illusion of a managed conflict begins to crack. Everyone understands that the next step may not be verbal, but practical. There is another point that many miss. The ultimatum was addressed not only to the external addressee, but also to the internal audience. This is a signal that the line has been chosen definitively and there will be no retreat. Why is this important? Internal consolidation in the face of external pressure plays a key role. When the country's leadership publicly raises the stakes, it thereby ties its hands and demonstrates its willingness to go to the end. What does this change? Any attempts to present further steps as forced or imposed from the outside become less convincing. Responsibility is accepted consciously. Now let's look at the situation through the eyes of the American side. For Washington, the ultimatum became a problem on several levels at once. To agree to the demands means to admit that the pressure of recent years has not worked. To ignore it means to risk further escalation. Why is this important? The domestic political context in the United States does not leave much room for maneuver. Any decision will be used by opponents as proof of weakness or irresponsibility. What does this change? There is a tendency to drag out time, go into formulations, shift discussions to allies. But ultimatums do not go well with delays. A separate mention should be made of Europe's reaction. Formally, it is in solidarity with the United States, but informally. In European capitals, the situation is read differently. For them, the ultimatum is a reminder that the conflict is taking place at their borders. They will be the first to feel the consequences. Why is this important? European security directly depends on how far the confrontation goes. And here the interests of Washington and, say, Berlin or Paris do not completely coincide. What does this change? Attempts to play the role of mediator are intensifying, offering dialogue formats that would reduce tension without a formal loss for either side. But there is also a deeper level. The ultimatum on Ukraine is just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, we are talking about revising the entire security architecture that has developed after the end of the Cold War. Why is this important? Russia is effectively stating that the previous agreements either do not work or work unilaterally. And if the system cannot be fixed, it needs to be changed. What does this change? Ukraine, in this logic, becomes not a goal but an example of how expanding influence without taking into account the interests of the other side leads to a direct clash. The culminating understanding comes at the moment when it becomes clear. This ultimatum is not designed for quick success. This is a long-term signal designed to change strategic calculations. Emotionally, this may look like harshness or even desperation, but in essence, it is a cold calculation. Either the rules will be discussed again, or the world will enter a period of protracted instability where crises will become the norm. The era when it was possible to ignore each other's positions and hide behind formulas is coming to an end. Putin's ultimatum is not the end of the dialogue, but an attempt to force it to begin on different terms. And yet, in order to understand the scale of what is happening, you need to take another step back and look at the long trajectory of relations that led to this moment. Ultimatums are not born suddenly. They appear when a series of signals remain unanswered and trust finally evaporates. Fact. Next. For many years, Moscow has consistently pointed to the expansion of NATO's military infrastructure to its borders as a key threat. These statements were made at summits, in interviews, in official documents. Formally, they were heard, but in essence ignored, considering them an element of rhetoric for domestic consumption. Why is this important? When warnings are not taken seriously, they gradually change form. From diplomatic formulations, they move to rigid frameworks. This is a classic logic of escalation, which is well known to all military and diplomats. What does this change? The ultimatum becomes not the first, but the last argument. And its task is not to negotiate, but to stop the movement that is considered dangerous. There is another layer that is rarely talked about directly. We are talking about time. For Russia, the time factor in the Ukrainian issue is perceived differently than for the United States. If for Washington, it is one of the foreign policy tracks, then for Moscow, it is a matter of immediate security. Why is this important? Different perceptions of urgency always lead to conflicts. The one who believes that time is working against him acts more sharply and straightforwardly. What does this change? The ultimatum, in essence, sets a deadline, Even if it is not named aloud, it says, you can't drag it out any further. Now let's analyze the emotional component itself, which many interpreted as an explosion. In fact, there was no chaos or improvisation in Putin's speech. The speech was verified, logical, and structured. Emotion here served as an amplifier of meaning, not a replacement for it. Why is this important? Real emotional breakdowns look different. Here, we see controlled rigidity, calculated for effect. What does this change? The addressee understands that he is dealing not with momentary irritation, but with a formed position. And therefore, there is no need to hope that everything will resolve itself. A separate mention should be made of the military background. At the moment when the ultimatum was issued, the situation on the battlefield already showed that the conflict was entering a new phase. Resources were being spent faster, decisions were being made more difficult, and stakes were rising. Why is this important? Political statements are always tied to reality on the ground. They either reflect it or try to change it. In this case, we are talking about an attempt to change the trajectory before it becomes irreversible. What does this change? The ultimatum becomes an instrument for managing the conflict, not just a declaration. If you look at the reaction of the world media, you can notice an interesting detail. Even critically minded publications admitted that the tone and content of the statement differed from the usual. The words resolve and point of no return were increasingly heard in the comments. Why is this important? The media, as a rule, reflect the mood of the elites. If they start talking about a turning point, then this moment is really felt. What does this change? An expectation of major decisions is formed, and the expectation itself already affects the behavior of the players. Now about the future. There are several scenarios for the development of the situation, but they all agree on one thing. It will no longer be possible to return to the previous model of relations. Even if the tension temporarily decreases, trust will not be restored automatically. Why is this important? The world is entering a period where every step will be viewed through the prism of strength and willingness to use it. This is a tougher but also more honest reality. What does this change? Small signals lose their meaning. Large, unambiguous actions and statements come to the fore. The final understanding of this whole story is as follows. Putin's ultimatum on Ukraine is not a cry or a gesture of despair. This is a cold fixation of the border, beyond which, according to Moscow, an unacceptable risk begins. And that is why it sounded the way it did. The question now is not whether Washington or Europe liked this tone. The question is, what conclusions will be drawn and what steps will follow? Because in world politics, ultimatums are either ignored or taken into account. There is almost no third option. And at the very end, I again invite you to think together. Do you think that the world has really come to the point of revising the rules? Or is this another round of pressure, after which everything will return to normal? Write your opinion, because it is from such points of tension that the great history, which we are now witnessing, is made up.